So tonight we're going to be talking about literature reviews, and hopefully you've had some experience doing literature reviews in the past. They're a critical part of anybody who's going to be taking on a research project. And when we talk about literature, we're talking about typically peer-reviewed academic journal articles and books, things where other researchers, oftentimes academic, but not necessarily, but those who have undertaken research endeavors have compiled all their data and their analysis, and they've put together some unique piece of knowledge that's been presented through research that they've done. And so when we talk about literature, we're usually talking about the quote-unquote scholarship that exists on a particular topic. And what we mean is we're looking at all of the published research up to a point on that particular topic from researchers who write journal articles and books in that area. Obviously, when we talk about reviewing this literature, we're talking about the critical examination of it. And so we're looking at a particular field or on a particular subject. Sometimes we're talking about government reports and things like think tank research. So where we're looking at, Rand Corporation, for example, might produce research and put out a policy report on a topic that might provide certain information. And so we're looking at all of those things with these journal articles to review and look at, really what the literature says. So the idea here is that we're trying to get up to speed and informed about a particular topic by looking at what other researchers have found in terms of relationships that exist, what has been identified or not identified as important factors, things that are findings with regard to evaluations that have been done on a particular topic, and all those sorts of things. So you could take, for example, recidivism as a topic, and there may be a lot of people who they do published research, and some of them will look at recidivism intervention programs and evaluate whether or not they have an impact in the particular community. And some of those programs and some of that research might be 5 years old, and some of it might be 20 years old, and some of it could be 50 years old. So you're going to want to look at all those different characteristics. You might find articles that look at a sample of individuals who commit crime, and then looks at social demographics to try to figure out if there are particular indicators or demographic characteristics that might predict whether someone's likely to commit crime or what type of crime, or whether they're likely to end up in jail or not. There could be research that looks at different intervening factors that have had an impact on minimizing the likelihood that someone ends up committing crime or ending up getting put in jail for crimes. And so any of those particular things might be important. And then there could be all kinds of other research that looks at politicians and how they feel about crime, and using the rhetoric in the media to get voters to support them. And there might be other things on economic impacts of crime and crime prevention programs and what those do for community financial outcomes. All those types of things could be areas or pieces of research that exist in the literature on recidivism. And so you need to be able to read through all this and understand and weed out what is relevant and what is not relevant to the research that you're doing that can help inform some of what you're working on. So, there's things we want to identify. So hopefully you can see this on the screen, this list here of 4 items. Things like central works, right? These are the kind of major articles that are, really, if you think about citation count, is a good way to consider this. That's not always necessarily the best case, but if there are articles or books on recidivism, typically we'll see these in older literature where the first major kind of national research piece on recidivism that happened in the 60s, for example. Not that that's actually a thing, but if there was, it might be cited thousands and thousands of times by other people's work, because it is one of the kind of main fundamental kind of starting points that everyone works back from when they look at original literature on this topic and then moves forward. So a lot of times you'll see literature reviews that happen chronologically, and so they typically want to look back, to where the major works, first occur, right, and then forward to now within that lineage. Right, central contribution. This idea is schools of thought. So sometimes there are different ways of maybe understanding recidivism, or there might be different arguments. For example, that there may be a whole line of scholarship that suggests, crime intervention programs don't really matter. People are biologically and sociologically predetermined to commit crime or not, and therefore, right, all of this is kind of a wasted effort. That may have been one school of thought where previously a lot of different literature all looked at, yes, well, there's positive, lots of positive reasons to believe that things can have an impact on individuals to keep them off the streets, help keep them out of jail, and after 20 years of research on that topic that really supported that idea, right, the central contribution of this new school of work was to change the direction and make an argument that contrasts what everybody had thought up to this point and finds data that suggests that that's possibly true. And so that would be a central contribution. And as you get later in the research review, you'll start to see that there's sometimes different schools and different trajectories where individuals take their ideas away from the pack and sort of the mainstream consensus opinion that might be forming. Strengths and weaknesses, obviously we're looking for both of these. Not every piece of research is going to be a good piece of research, and some of it is done very well, some of it's done poorly, and a lot of it's done somewhere in between. And so you want to consider both from an argument perspective, right? Do they have a strong argument or a weak argument? And do you see things that are potentially either problematic or things that are well-reasoned and stuff like that? Right? We also care about, from a methodology perspective, because it's a research methods class, they have different decisions about how they choose to collect data, right? So this could be their measures, this could be their sample, this might be, time frame, how long the study was conducted, this might be their control group that they're using, or the lack thereof. Any of those things are methodological decisions that have to be made, right? How many people? Where do you get those people from? Do you follow people after they're released from jail for 6 months or 12 or 18? Right? All of these type of things that affect our data collection and our analysis are things that are methodological decisions, and there's going to be some that are drawbacks and some of those that make the research better. Right? Somebody who only uses a sample of 9 inmates who were released from white-collar crimes in a New England prison, right, is not going to probably be able to say as valuable things about recidivism as somebody who gets 1,500 inmates from multiple major federal prisons from across major areas in the United States. So thinking about those things, right, well, what are those methodological weaknesses and strengths to the research article that you're reading? And when there are strengths, you want to identify those, because they may be things you want to use for your own evaluation proposal, for your own research. If there's a measurement scale, a very common one is like looking at post-traumatic stress or mental health or things like that. Scholars may have come up with a 25-question instrument that assesses post-traumatic stress severity and how bad it is in the patient. Right? Measuring post-traumatic stress is not easy, and if you feel like that is a strength of that article, you may want to cite back to that article, that instrument that's being used, and then utilize it as well for your measurement strategy. So, strengths and weaknesses, if somebody has, a sample that you deem as too small, right? Or otherwise it's a good piece of research, except for the fact that, it only takes place in Nebraska, and you don't believe that, the behavior of prisoners in Nebraska necessarily reflects those of anywhere else in the United States. You might take the same exact research design, but address the weakness by improving on the sample and saying, well, we're going to go get 100 some odd more individuals from across the United States, but do everything else the same way to improve on that methodology. So really this here, in terms of strengths and weaknesses, is kind of a bread and butter place for you to both identify ways to improve and make better research from the research that already exists. Right? But in terms of your evaluation proposals, one of the things you have to do along with making a decision about your methodology is to justify that decision. And the best way to justify any decision is to use a literature review and identify multiple pieces of peer-reviewed published research that do things methodologically the same way that you are suggesting that you would, right? Because now you're no longer in a position where you're arguing with me about the merits of your decision, right? But you're supporting the decision by showing that many other scholars who do the research on the same topic do it in that same way, and that becomes useful. Practical limitations or practical implications, right? There may be, it may be the first evaluation study of its kind that shows that the Affordable Care Act had a significant positive impact on healthcare enrollment, or it may be the first evaluation that shows No Child Left Behind as a national policy started to have long-term improvement on child's test scores. Any of those are major practical implications that could come out of a piece of research, right, that are, it kind of goes back to the central contribution idea, but usually when we're looking at sort of applied policy research, things that have these major implications that are informative and useful tend to be ones that we also want to identify and care about. Why do we conduct a literature review? We want to see what others have found, right? If 55 pieces of published literature out there show that time after time after time, let's say there's a program called the Bar to Prison Initiative that helps educate people in prisons to make sure that they are able to find a job when they are released from prison and be able to sustain themselves without having to go back to crime. If there are 20 different pieces of literature that evaluate educational intervention programs in prisons that find over and over and over again they have no impact, right? That matters whether you're a researcher, that matters if you're a policymaker, and if you work for somebody who's either involved in a program like that, it should give you some guidance on things you should be concerned about, right? And being able to look into those different pieces of scholarship to figure out how they did the research, what did they find specifically, and are there things that you can do differently than those other programs that might give you a better shot? Thinking about the specific question you want to ask, oftentimes researchers who publish things publish ideas that are things missing from the literature. And so the point of doing the literature review is to see everything that's out there so that you can find the gap of what is not known, right, and do research on that element of what is not known. So, my dissertation looked at voter preferences for the federal budget and spending, right? And one of the things that happens over and over and over again, right, is that people ask questions about, why do people have particular preferences and what do they have preferences for, right? One of the things that didn't seem to be the case is that anybody was asking, if we expose people to different information, right, do their preferences change? It's not that we want to explain what they are. We want to explain that if they have them and they move, to a different set of preferences, can that be swayed by different things, right? So that's a question that was missing from the literature. That was the one I wanted to ask, and that wasn't present, anywhere else. The other thing is this thinking through what we know and identifying what is novel. Sometimes this means, in terms of novel, introducing something that is novel. So one of the things, with dissertations, they require you to come up with something that is a unique contribution. It's novel. It's not something people have done before. So looking at both the same research question, right, but coming up with a new style of measurement, adding a new measurement that hasn't been used before, or in my case, one that was not used for about 40 years and then adapted to more modern times, right, was a novel thing to add to the literature, right? But when we know what already exists out there, we can identify, something that is new. Maybe we are producing that novel idea, right? Or maybe it's that we find the one article that does stand out from the other 50 over the last, 45 years, because it's making a contribution that is novel. And that's the thing that we want to start looking at a little more thoroughly. And conducting a literature review, well, how do we do it, right? The practical realities are, most of the time you're going to go to your library databases. That's really where we're going to start. So one of them that, is kind of the easy starting point, I think, for anyone is Google Scholar. It's basically the way of searching Google, but searching, peer-reviewed academic literature, makes it very easy because you can kind of, search the way you're familiar, but only get academic results. There's others, right, like EBSCO, Academic Search Premier is another one. Any of these type of things that you might be familiar with, right? They are, JSTOR is another. Any of these are repositories that basically have catalogs of published academic literature in them that you're able to search, right? And so some of these are more common in the social sciences, right? There's others like PubMed is one that if you work in medical schools or public health where you really want to look at medical journals or things medical specific without getting other material that's outside the medical field, there's things like that. But the idea is that you want to start with these library databases because in modern times, they make it immensely easy for you to get up to speed quickly and to be able to search in a kind of typical search engine fashion that we're used to. Right? We're using that process to search the evidence base. So one of the things that you have to do, right, any good Google search, refining your research question, identifying keywords, right? You might want to use the word, you may want to say, right, recidivism right off the bat. But after you start searching and finding journal articles, you might find that, right, incarceration is a better word to look for, or rearrest may be something that comes up a lot more. Right, whereas you might also be thinking about, predictors of, recidivism, right? But it's actually, factors or, say risk characteristics or something like that. So a lot of times you might be looking at articles where, you think you want to call it, recidivism predictors, when in actuality it's, rearrest risk factors is typically the lingo in the academic term in the world, right? So sometimes it's just a matter of figuring out that you don't want to use this and you don't want to use this, right? And you need to search a couple times to figure out that these are the words you want to use. So, and this is a process, right? So you might start looking for, voter knowledge, right? And then what you find is that people start using the term information effects, right? And so you find an article that uses that term, then you search information effects and you find a lot more articles that use that same terminology. And so you get in a situation where as you search and find new articles, you're able to better define and talk about what it is that you're looking for, right, to be able to get more information that's usable and continue doing that. So it's an ongoing cycle. But you also want to screen and screen your search results for relevance, right? So the idea of the abstract, why do we have an abstract in academic research? Well, because it's a pain in the butt to read the entire 30-page article to try to get an idea of what the article is about, right? You want to be able to look at that first page, right? Read this abstract here, and then from it get enough information within a paragraph or a half page about what research is being conducted, how it's being conducted, and what they find, so you can decide whether that is relevant or not to the work that you're doing, and whether you want to spend more time looking at that article in detail. And then in the reading that you were assigned, we have this idea called the CHIP process. Right, so you can see this here, CHIP, right? Things we want to look for. And this typically are general characteristics you might be able to consider when you're looking at an article and really digesting whether or not it is relevant. Right? So you care about the context, right? Is it the same or is it different in context than what your application is that you care about? So, if you're looking at an urban nonprofit program that takes place in downtown Long Beach and is targeted for, low-income minority youth populations, right? And you find other evaluation research, do they have the same context? Do they have a different context? Is it urban, minority, and low income, but it's in New York City? Right? That might be more relevant and useful to you than something that is in Missouri, maybe, right? Or maybe it's a similar program, right? But it's a predominantly, it's 20 years old, so the context is a lot different because the environment has changed since then. And so, contextually speaking, it might be still worth reading, right? But to be identifying that context is different than what you're dealing with, right? Or maybe it's an international program, and so there's a lot of differences there, and the context might be not applicable. How? The methodology. Right? It's another way of saying what methods do they use, right? Coming back to, right, the measure, right, the research question, the right, the treatment and control groups, and we'll talk about these more later, right? The design, which we will refer to later as the X's and O's framework, all of those type of things, right? The length of the study is another one. All of those are methods questions, or the how of how did they collect the data, right? Do they use surveys, interviews, focus groups, secondary administrative data? All of those type of questions that need to be answered about, well, how did you collect the data and analyze it to get to the conclusion that you found, right? Those are the things that we need to be concerned with, and those are the things that we want to look at in the abstract to figure out, right, is it useful to us? Is it useful because it's bad and it can be improved upon? Is it useful because it's good and we can borrow from it? Is it useful just because it's different and so it gives me some ideas about where to start, right, and to go my own direction with it? Issues, we're looking at challenges that they run into. A lot of times academics who are transparent with their work will talk about future research implications and future research they would like to do, right? Not every piece of research goes perfect as according to plan. And so sometimes they will talk about problems that they ran into, right? Challenges that they faced and things that need to be looked at further because they just weren't able to, maybe it's because they didn't find the conclusion that they thought they were going to find. Maybe it's because that there was something happened halfway through their study that mitigated their ability to do any of the analysis that they wanted. Right? Are there unique problems that the literature, has running through them that they identify that you want to be made aware of? So any of those type of things, right? And then population, think of this as sample, right? We'll talk about sampling, later in the class, but the idea of the, right, who is the ones that we're getting data from, how many are we collecting data from, right, and how did we choose those individuals to participate in our study, right? Do they look like the target population we care about from an evaluation perspective, so that we can get, gain insights from that population? So when we're looking at literature reviews, right, we want to critically, right, evaluate. We're not just reading and summarizing. We expect you to be able to read the entire thing. It's a graduate level endeavor to do research. You should be able to read it, understand it, and regurgitate what they are saying, right? What we want you to be able to do is, right, critique, right? We want you to be able to synthesize, and we want you to be able to utilize. So the idea being that, well, critique means to evaluate, provide feedback about where they have done a good job versus done a poor job, right? Not just summarizing what they did, but saying where they could have done better or where they, maybe overlooked important elements. Synthesize means that we want to look at other pieces of literature and not just, again, not summarizing, but tying them into one another. So if we find different articles from different time periods, are there patterns that we see? Do they use methodological similarities between them? Do they use different methodological decisions? And is there a good reason for that? Right? What are those patterns that you see between articles and books where authors are doing different things? Right? How can you bring those together or draw, both patterns or differences between them and point out the uniqueness amongst them? Right? And then the idea to utilize is, if they're good or they have good arguments or they have strong decisions methodologically, right, borrow from those and cite them accordingly to help you do your own research so that you're not reinventing the wheel every time, right, but you have a strong foundation to work upon. Right? So you want to ask questions like, are the research questions clear? Do you understand them? Are the following decisions, right, clearly described? Again, this comes back to the methods part. Are they doing it well in a way that you can understand? Is it technically correct by, statistical standards and those type of things? Are they appropriate to the research question? Meaning, is the data that they're collecting, right, actually the data that you would need to answer the research question that they're asking, or is it doing something else? do the claims that they're making and the conclusions, are they supported by the evidence that they're presenting? Right? All of these type of things are ways of kind of critically examining the research that's out there and helping to do a better job of interpreting it and applying it and using it, not just being a passive reader who can summarize. And so you can think of this as a spreadsheet. This is a good way of typically looking at how to set up sort of a note sheet for yourself. Right? So think of each of these rows as an article or a book. So this would be number 6 here. Right? And what you can start to do is, as you're reading abstracts, right, start to fill in each of these columns, right, to help you better summarize the different patterns and similarities between them. And I would typically say that, methods is one that's going to be a little, it's going to be a lot of information to put in there. So you might need to break this out and add other things like, maybe measurement. Right? We have sample size, but you might want control group, right? Or you can do X's and O's once you get familiar with that lingo, right? You might use the term instrument, which is another way of talking about measurement. But is there a particular, do they use surveys? Do they use focus groups? How do they collect the data? You can also talk about time period, right? So in each of these, you can say, well, for this Boylan article, right, well, here's the research question that they're looking at. Here's the purpose of the study as stated, right, in their abstract. You might be able to say that they have, 1,500 people, right, from North Carolina in their sample. Right? They use surveys. Right? It's a 1997 study, something like that. Right? Findings, right? Recidivism, right? Increases with poverty or something. More poverty you are, the more likely you are to end up back in jail. Right? Other notes here. Right? Same thing. Right? Now we can come back down. We fill out this information. Methodologically, this might be 763 people, right, from this might be Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, right? And so this was also using surveys, right? But this was 2015, right? And so now you can start to look at, well, what are the differences in this category as we look at the methodology, right, and the samples, and where are we seeing things missing? Well, I'm in California. I see North Carolina. I see Pacific Northwest. Right? Maybe this is Oklahoma, and this is Georgia, right? And this is New York, right? And what we see is there's no California studies that exist, and therefore there's an opportunity for us to tackle doing our own research where we see California as a new opportunity to collect data to do something different, right? Or maybe it's the fact that, right, none of them, right, use a population, right, across the United States. Right? They only are one state specific, and we want to broaden our research by making it better and including a lot of different folks. And so we have results that extrapolate not just any one particular prison system, but maybe a program that spans multiple sites and potentially has broader reach, right? So as we fill this out, right, it becomes a good way of taking each of these, right, reading each abstract and putting this together. And I would encourage you, since you're going to have to write both a discussion post reviewing an article, as well as do a literature review assignment and have a literature review for your proposal, to produce something like this for yourselves, because each time you read an article or find an article that you read the abstract for that meets, right, or sounds like it's going to meet your needs, you can fill in some of these basic elements. And you might want to look at these columns and look at these kind of items here, and specifically think about all the questions that we look at in the syllabus. So you'll see, we'll talk next week about research questions, right, and hypotheses, for example, right? Then we'll talk about measurement, right? And then we'll talk about design, or your X's and O's framework. And then we'll talk about samples. And if you treat each of these items, right, as a column, right? You're now going through our syllabus and you're looking at all the topics that have to do with methodology and then trying to extrapolate from each of these articles that information. So, right, purpose maybe not necessary, right? But findings probably are, because you want to know the conclusion, but you can use this research question, right, and this sample category and this method section, right, maybe one or two others, to be able to spell out all of those methodology points in a nice, clear, concise table for you to look through to make it easy on yourself to then synthesize, look through patterns, compare and contrast, right? When I do this type of an activity, I'll also put like publication year, right? So that way I can also say this is 2003, 2017, 2012, and that way if I want to put them chronologically in my literature review, because that's one way of writing them out, right? I can sort by that column on my spreadsheet and can then start working my way back from the top as I talk about them all, right? And then you might want to also include another, right? This one has to do with maybe economic factors because they're talking about poverty. This one also talks about economic factors. This one talks about health, right? This one talks about economic. And now what you're doing is you're starting to identify, right, these synthesis areas where you can aggregate information and talk about the patterns. And you can say that, well, this article, and this article, right, have differences in their methodology, but they all kind of fall into the same scope of analysis, looking at poverty, education, and employment outcomes, things related to economics, as opposed to these other articles that may be looking at health factors and whether that plays a role in somebody's crime rates. Right. So critical thinking skills, obviously, right, we do need to summarize, but not a lot. So anytime we're going to be doing a lit review, right, you can't just presume everybody's read every article that you're talking about. The difference is, if you think about having 4 to 6 sentences to be able to discuss one particular journal article, right, 3 to 5 of them, right, should not be your summary, right? You might have 2 sentences of summary and 4 sentences of synthesis, analysis, and evaluation, right? The idea being that a literature review is not designed to prove to somebody else that you've read these articles. It's presumed that you've read them, and that will show through the analysis and the evaluation and the critique and synthesis portions. So summary, right? You really want to be able to talk about the methods and talk about the findings, but do that summary in the context of integrating it with the rest of the discussion that you're going to be having about some of these things, right? So looking at key ideas, major findings and takeaways that are critical for someone to be able to know, right? But then also talking about, well, what was the sample? Well, you can say, the sample was taken of 2,500 residents of North Carolina. One of the reasons why that is also an area to improve is because blah, 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 right? Now what you've done is you've summarized, right? So you can say I've summarized plus, right, something else. So provide the summary, right, but then add the synthesis, right? Or provide the summary and then add the critique. So now what you're doing is you're not just summarizing, right, but you're integrating the summary with some other element, and therefore not just spending a lot of time reiterating what the abstract says. Analysis, this is where, right, how are the data classified or categorized? What trends is the author finding? Are there similars or differences in the results compared to other articles that you find that are similar? Right? What variables are being examined? All of those type of things, looking at the analysis that was conducted could be examined more critically and discussed in your review. Right? And then an evaluation. Right? Do you believe what they're saying? Did they miss major things that would make their conclusion different if they'd have done something differently? Right? Does it seem like there are ways to make the study better? For example, if somebody does a study on recidivism that happens to last 4 months after somebody's been released, is that a long enough amount of time to follow somebody? If you say 97% of everyone didn't end up back in jail, right? But it takes typically people 2 months on average after they're out of jail to even get reoriented back to their home, right? And if they get, into more criminal activity, it could take them, 3 to 6 months on average to basically be caught for it, prosecuted, and put back in jail. You might be looking at a 6 to 9 month timeline before you know anything. And therefore, that's a judgment call that that article is missing a major kind of critical step that would improve the quality of that work. So, when you're writing it up, right, you can do things where this is how you synthesize and summarize at the same time, where you can say, X, Y, and Z scholars, right, or the work by Johnson, Williams and Daniels, and Johansson, right, 3 separate articles, all seem to find that such and such happened. You've aggregated that information together into one kind of summary and synthesis statement altogether. Right? You can look at these, saying most studies on developmental education are quantitative, or of the 15 articles that I found, 72% of them all seem to use a particular survey, right? And that seems to be the industry standard. And that is also another way, is also the survey that I intend to use for my own research proposal, right? That's now a summary, right, and a synthesis and an extrapolation all into one statement. And that's a really good way about going through this process. Critique, right? More qualitative studies are needed to understand student perspectives. So there may be a glaring hole that says, well, a lot of people use quantitative studies, but there's 12 that I found, and out of all of these, they seem to ignore this critical point, which is asking people that are students what they actually think, as opposed to just looking at their outcomes, right? So maybe outcomes are going up, but everybody's miserable and they hate the class, or they don't feel like they're learning, even though test scores would suggest they are, and that's why we need, right, to understand these two perspectives. Right? So that's where we start to synthesize and integrate the research to make improvements on doing it better next time around. When you write it up, obviously, if you have that note sheet where you take the spreadsheet to summarize all your results, you can do a historical analysis. So you can just start, right, from the oldest articles first and work your way towards, right, present day. That's one way that happens, and that's typically common. One of the things that is more often is probably a combination of these, right? So we may just go historically, right, but we may also identify themes. So we may look at, the first major work, right, and some of the themes that get us to present day, right, but then a different school of thought emerged 20 years later, and then kind of another set of literature continued forward, and then out of that, a third school of thought started in the 80s that brings us to current day. So we might use chronological, but we might have, these 3 different kind of thematic differences between the school, right, where these are maybe qualitative, right, and these are heavily statistical, right, and these are experimental, right? And so we've identified methodological themes, right, but we still place them in groupings where we talk about them historically to show how things changed in qualitative research. Right? Out of that, there's an origin of statistical research and how that changed, right? And then experiments started to be the hip new trend, right? And so now there's this lineage of those as well. Right? We might also talk about methodology. Right? This is a good example of that, where we've identified kind of the broader methodology used, right? Or there might be something that has to do with, a particular survey that is used, for 35 years until somebody comes up with a, survey 2, which is a different style of technique, and those come into play, right? And then what we really start is a shift towards more focus groups, right? Methodologically speaking, and maybe they're not chronological, but we're just clustering those that use this strategy with those that use this strategy with those that use this strategy to talk about them in bunches, right, before we go into the synthesis. So that's another way of grouping this when you're actually writing it all up, and are able to present that in the narrative itself. So any questions about literature reviews, how they work, any of that type of considerations that you have in terms of how do you do this, how to make it work, where to find articles, anything like that at all?